Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. This is Andrew Stratelates with the Red Pill Religion podcast. You can always find us at redpillreligion.com, and we always need your spiritual and financial support. This is a volunteer effort, but sometimes we have bills to pay for bandwidth and other things. So please give us a like, give us a subscribe, and continue watching and praying for us. Once again, I'm Andrew Stratelates here today with Josh Brister, and we're giving a little bit of an after show on a debate that Josh had with Dan Barker of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. So, Josh, go ahead and give us a summary of the discussion you had with him.
Well, I think it went really, really well. I wasn't expecting, a rapid fire, all these arguments coming at me. But so I returned them, and I wasn't buying a lot of these little arguments from him. So I think it got a little heated. I think I don't know. I think it shook him a little, in my opinion. And, you know, I remember during the debate, he called me a bad teacher. I teach American history. I don't think he does. Um, it was just funny. The overall, looking back on it, I think I did really well. And, yeah, so.
Yeah, and I noticed that too as the debate went on. It became more and more heated, and I actually tried to call a timeout at the end, but apparently Dan didn't agree that that was the prudent thing to do, and ended up leaving. So I just want to make sure that Dan knows that we still wish the absolute best for him, and
Yes.
hope that he will join us some other time. Um,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he can come back anytime. I think, and we can have another discussion. Um, and we want to go over some of these arguments, but they need to know. I've been studying all these arguments for such a long time, and I know you have, and I know there are some other people. We're taking these new atheists on. I debated, of course, Dr. Graham Alpe this week. I'm very happy how that debate went too. And we have some more debates lined up with the Atheist Alliance International. And I, in fact, we have also discussions lined up. If you can believe this, we have a discussion lined up for this summer with the great British scholar N.T. Wright, the great British New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. And that's going to be lively. I think we're going to be discussing the miracles and the resurrection of Jesus. I also have some debates with some other PhDs coming up, Dr. Stephen Hicks, and I even have a round two. Me and Dr. Graham Oppie are in negotiation to figure out a topic for maybe somewhere in June. Um, Maybe we'll discuss miracles or something else, some more a topic that's more focused. But we are definitely here at Red Pill Religion. We are bringing the debate to the atheists, to the anti-theists, and we're not going to stop.
that's right. And I just want to mention two books that I'll link in the description. That after a little thought, I'd be really interested with Dan Barker or anyone else from the Freedom from Religion Foundation to answer the things in these books. One of them is The New Atheist Denial of History by Painter, and the other one is Storming the Heavens by Daniel Paris. And both of these are very deep books into some of the rhetoric that these new atheists are using, and the historical falseness of them. The New Atheist Denial of History specifically talks about these tropes and absurdities that they bring up that basically make new atheists like even Sam Harris the historical
Mm-hmm.
the historical equivalent of basically Holocaust deniers, that that
Yeah.
that they're not engaging in anything
Yeah.
real.
Yeah.
And Storming the Heavens is a book on the Soviet League of the Militant Godless, who basically aimed to destroy religion through murder, basically. And a lot of the propaganda and tropes and talking points that you see from the new atheists are the same ones that these Soviets basically used, who engaged in genocide, not only against Christians, but believing Jews and other religions as well.
Yeah, that's what happens when you look at a people group, and you view people not as individuals but as the whole group. That's when these utilitarian concepts and these other types of concepts start coming in. When I'm debating more and more with these guys, what I keep noticing is the more you discuss things that are adrift from their narrow specialization, the weaker and weaker their arguments come. Look, these guys are not usually trained in history. They're trained in philosophy, or some specialization in philosophy. But when you discuss history with them, or the historical process, or the history of ideas, this integration. In fact, I had a discussion. Me and SJ had a discussion with Dr. Lydia McGrew, who wrote this great book, Hidden in Plain View, about many of the gospel coincidences, unplanned coincidences that can be found all throughout the gospels. William Paley, the great Christian apologist of the 18th and 19th century, he actually formulated this argument and discussed it at some length, and others have too. But what I'm trying to say is that when you look at history, when you look at the overall case from not just uh, science, but philosophy and theology and history and economics and psychology and anthropology, they have a very difficult time integrating these different fields. So when you take them out of their own little specialization, they become, you know, lost almost.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean that's true of any specialist, including myself, right? If you take me out of philosophy and science and start doing history with me, I'll fumble and flounder. But I think the key part is to understand a complex phenomena like religion or like Christianity. You need this very broad and deep multidisciplinary approach, because it involves philosophy, it involves epistemology, it involves history, it involves logic, and all these other things
Mm-hmm.
to,
Yeah.
to sort of understand it, right? And in some sense, I mean, this makes sense, right? Religions in general, and Christianity especially, mirrors the human soul.
Yeah.
So every part of the human soul gets something in the religion to sort of mirror it.
Yeah, it's that integration, how you integrate all of these different fields. Um, what I've been bringing up as of recent is that 18th and 19th century school of thought that originated in Scotland, called common sense realism, the Scottish common sense school. You had scholars like Dougal Stewart, and especially Thomas Reid, and who just devastated David Hume and John Locke. It's a theory called the ideal theory, where ideas are representations. What we can know is not reality itself, but the ideals in our head. Um, and of course, Kant dealt with that. And when you deal with reality, a lot of this skepticism comes from David Hume and the Enlightenment thinkers. For example, in our discussion today, me, SJ, and Dr. Lydia McGrew, we discussed Richard Carrier, his, willful, I guess, thinking, trying to do biblical scholarship, thinking it's a myth, or the historical Jesus is based on a myth. Um, you know, or Bart Ehrman, for example, saying that we can't know a lot of things in the Bible. A lot of that is just unjustified skepticism. When if they try to live it in everyday life, the common sense approach, they would fall flat. It's only when they get in their little special niche of scholarship where they can make these pronouncements. But once you take them out, you have to live according to common sense, and that's something that Thomas Reed and the common sense realism school talked about. So a lot of these arguments, they're really built on straw, and I keep hearing a lot of them over and over again. In my recent debate with Dan Barker, I noticed I saw a noticeable difference between when I was debating him and when I was debating Dr. Graham Oppie. Dr. Graham Oppie is a brilliant thinker, and he's not one of these, new atheists or a person who takes this unmitigated skepticism for granted. Uh, Dan Barker seem to think everything was a contradiction in the Bible, or there's no possible good reasons for belief in God, or a person can't be a thoughtful, rational person and believing in God. It was just a very big contrast, and it was fairly easy with my debate with him.
Yeah, and I agree that there was a real distinct difference in sort of the discussion, and and that's sort of the thing too, right? Is and what is the philosophy that you end up embodying in your actions in your life? And by philosophy, I mean general like philosophy of life. And that's sort of a very important question, and one that Jordan Peterson, I think, is sort of bringing to the forefront once again, that metaphysics is something, or the structure of reality is something that you discuss, but it's also something that you live out, right? And that's sort of the question of
Exactly.
what axioms or what beliefs are you living out in your life? And that's then the question is, if you're living out stable things in your life, then in some sense those stable things that you're keeping are what are sacred to you. And so that's the question, is what sacred values do you hold?
Yeah, we live according to a hierarchy of value. We live according to, like, we're able to detect things. Basically, when we go outside, or when we decide to do something, or before we even decide to do something, we are focusing our attention, our eyes, in fact, our retinas are focusing on particular objects in the world. So you have this huge, flowing, rich river of stimuli constantly flowing, and we're picking out certain things. It's as if we see the world as different tools, not mere objects that can be reduced to, mere molecules, or reductionist philosophy. That's what a reductionist philosophy would say. But we view things as tools or wholes that we can manipulate and to the benefit of mankind. And that takes something called in psychology. It's called perceptual constancy. Um, it's looking at something, from all different angles, but knowing intuitively that it's the same thing and focusing on it. We can never do science if we did not believe that science was first possible, or that progress was possible. So there's so many things that the naive skeptic, and I know this is harsh, but the naive skeptic, like a possible, like Dan Barker, to be frank, and I know he's a nice person, but I did see this marked contrast between Dr. Alpi and Dan Barker, and I think it was crystal clear during our debate.
Yeah, and that's sort of the other thing, right? And Dr. Oppie acknowledged and said it was a very important point that the beliefs you hold actually determine in some sense how you see the world, right? So that just as you were saying, we look at things as tools to some objective, but the objective that we hold before we start looking at the world will determine what tools we see, right? and and that's sort of the interesting thing is that in order to learn anything we have to have some starting point, and there's this really weird dialectic or this dance between the beliefs we take or how open-minded we are or our heart is to things and what we see in the world. And
Yeah,
and I think that's a really important point,
yeah,
and actually one of the reasons why it's so difficult to convince someone through like verbal reasoning or debate that they should change their mind, because we can always change some other belief.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. I think we see. I think both the skeptic and the believer, we live as if God does exist, and this is what I mean. We live in a way that we are created in such a way that we can understand reality. That we believe in other minds existing also. We believe in these commonsensical beliefs of the external world, but we also believe you know we can progress. We can use science to discover rational laws, and find these scientific laws of the universe. And science originated. It originated once and only once in Christian Europe. There's. It's not just me saying this. This is a lot of scholars, both historians and sociologists, who have said this. Now, I'm not talking about crafts or um, mere mathematics or something like that. I'm talking about experimental science, the Newtonian or Francis Bacon approach to science. And uh, uh, I believe it was Francis Bacon who wrote the Nova Organum. And I believe it was 1620. And this was in stark contrast to what was happening all over the world, and especially in China or in other parts. So, this belief in progress, this belief in science, this belief that things can be known in and of themselves, that the commonsensical would believed. And again, this is how we operate day to day. So, I do think it would be really hard to convince someone, like you said, to believe in God on the basis of these mere arguments, because what they're doing and how they live their life, they're already testifying to belief in God.
yeah, and just to hammer that home even a bit more, you're basically left with one choice, right? Either in principle the human mind can know things as they are, or we're just modeling things or creating things in our mind. And if we can know things as they are, that points to the universe having teleology and having some sort of mind that we can touch and interact with through the symbolic world, which is God. Or it means that all models are just models, and so we can't judge a model except on what consequences it has. And therefore, the physics is not better than, say, like animism, right? The belief in spirits. It's just different. And so both physics and animism are ways of modeling the world that have different uses. And in either of these cases, the sort of materialist Western atheism falls down, because either in one case there's God, and the other is that their model of atheism is just one model among many, and it depends on the purpose that you're trying to solve with it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly believe all that. Here's the funny thing. I often hear people, trash without knowing much philosophy at all. Trash Aristotle and Aristotle's understanding of causation. Um, David Hume said causation was just the mere repetition of things we can get we can know or we get experience inductively, and he doubted that in the real world, but in his private life, of course, he lived he lived as if Aristotelian causation was true. We all live as if things there are final causes in the world. Let's say we intend to do something. Well, that's a final cause. That intentionality to different things. We can't just say that causes are the mere repetition of things. In fact, we could never know that two events, say two billiard balls hitting together, we could never know that one causes the other if we didn't already have a notion of a gentle or agent causation within us. To use by analogy, we can say billiard ball A causes billiard ball B to move when it hits it, because we know it by analogy, by our own active powers, that there are that can happen. So Aristotle, I don't think philosophy has gotten much better since Aristotle, actually, and certainly not from Hume.
Yeah, and especially his metaphysics. There are some alternative theories, but they're based on things just as old as Aristotle, and that actually reminds me of an anecdote from Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher, and he said, "I'd love to be a servant of a skeptic." And I would draw a bath, and it would be ice cold, and the skeptic would complain, the bath is cold, and I would tell him, no, it's warm, it just appears to be cold. And continue doing tricks like that, and sort of make him try to either deny his skepticism of, like, appearances of things aren't the same as the thing themselves, or acknowledge that they're not really skeptical in real life.
Yeah, skepticism, when you get to the heart of it, it's self defeating. You cannot be skeptical of your own skepticism. That it would be a knowledge stopper. In fact, how we know things is by knowledge used to be understood as justified true belief. It was that belief, the belief in progress, that gave way to the eventual emergence of science. It was an evolutionary process, but I know a number of scholars who said Christianity was the sufficient and necessary condition for science to get underway, because in in the cultures around when the scientific revolution was beginning, in Arab culture, or in Africa, or in Asian culture, or China or the Americas, there wasn't real science, but more mere crafts and so forth. Science was an enterprise of networks of people who believed that of experimentation and theorizing of the future. Um, so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, well, I'll just go on that a little bit. And a great example of this is Johann Kepler, who basically looked at his astronomical work as reading or discerning the reality that God had written, but instead of writing it in Hebrew or in Greek like it was in the Bible, he wrote it in mathematics. And in some sense, that's sort of the Christian ideal of science, right? That nature that is discernible through our senses and through the scientific method is written for us to understand just as much as the gospel and Bible is. And the other interesting thing too is most of the scientific revolution and great ideas that came from like Anglican and Catholic priests who did it as a hobby, and just sort of did their scholarly pastoral work, and then as a hobby engaged in science. And sort of ironically, the hobbyists did a lot better at it than the modern professional scientists, at least if you look at the number of discoveries versus like hours worked and stuff like that.
Well, science is a cultural institution, and I have right here Rodney Stark's "How the West Was Won: The Neglected Story of the Triumph of Modernity." He surveys notable scientists, the very top ones, between 1543, when Copernicus's De Revolutionatis was published. I think I butchered that name. And 1680, and of the 52 noteworthy scientists, only one was a skeptic. Um, it was all of them were explicitly and devout Christians working in the field that not only were explicitly Christian, and believed in progress and believed that God had ordered the universe according to certain rational laws that could be discovered. The remarkable thing is they actually discovered those laws, but that's how science originated. It originated nowhere else. And you know how I like to quote. I could quote on for a day with notable scholars and scientists saying just what I'm saying right here. Um, anyway, be that as it may, and I certainly do hope someone brings this up in some possible debate. I don't think they'll be prepared for this. But I look forward to debating the top skeptics, and I know you do too. We're we're studied. We're ready for this, and we're hoping that the skeptics come on Red Pill Religion, and we'll have a friendly discussion. But it's going to be an academic debate and discussion. So be prepared.
That's exactly right. And um, I'll do a little bit of analysis of the Dan Barker debate right now. Is that there are a couple tropes that he uses, right? Well, the first thing he talked about is that atheism is the default position, and that's just false. Atheism, if it is a position and not just a cognitive state, is worthy of a defense just as much as any other philosophy of life is. So
Yeah.
and that's the thing, and that's sort of one of the frustrations I have is some of these professional atheists are using these rhetorical positions to make their job easier in debates
Well,
rather than really struggling with the issue.
that's definitely something that Graham Oppy would not say, a professional philosopher. Now, I could have emphasized it more because I believe he was taking on something called meta epistemological skepticism, where he says the only true knowledge is from our five senses. I did bring up verificationism in the debate, but there were so many points. I wanted to tackle a lot of his points. But at the first of the debate, I did bring up a significant quote from Cal Neeson. And let me just read the quote again, which I did on the debate. It says, "To show that an argument is invalid or unsound is not to show that the conclusion of the argument is false. all the proofs of God's existence may fail, but it still may be the case that God exists. In short, to show that the proofs do not work is not enough in itself. It may still be the case that God exists. Um, yeah, a lot of these professional atheists, they have these talking points. And yeah, I definitely believe I could have said more on that, but you know, it's really a bogus statement.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about where does knowledge come from, right? If you believe that the belief that all knowledge comes, and sorry, this is sort of a complex topic, but I'll try to simplify. Um, in order to interpret sense data, you need to have some prior knowledge of how to interpret it. You can't start with induction, basically. And you can make evolutionary arguments that we've gotten this inductive process through evolution, and that's where the prior knowledge comes from. But the thing is, evolution is a system that maximizes survival, not true belief. And so, if that's the case, there's no reason to believe our prior beliefs are accurate about the world, just that they lead to the behaviors that allow us to survive. And that's a defeater for all human knowledge at that point.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely, and that's a great argument. That's Alvin Plantinga's naturalistic argument. Well, his argument against naturalism, um, that to even be an atheist, or to be a radical empiricist, you would have to believe that all knowledge comes from the world of sense data. But how do you justify that position? That's something that Immanuel Kant discussed, and he said, even though all our this is in reply to Hume, he said, even though all our knowledge uh, comes from experience, comes from the five senses, it's not grounded. So even though it arises from experience, it's not grounded in sense data. So that's why he postulated the existence of God.
yeah, and to be fair, there are some contexts where, as a matter of craft, only going on what your senses say is helpful, right? So to use an example, let's say that you're having an argument with your spouse or something. If you can divide in your mind what you actually see them saying or doing from how you're interpreting it, that's very helpful with sort of untangling things that are confusing there. Or, let's say you're a chemist and you're developing a new drug. If you focus on what the instruments are telling you, that allows you to have a context where not only you can do things, but many people can put their brains to it.
Yeah, and that's the whole Newtonian Bacon approach. The collect the data from the phenomenal world, and try to make theories on that, not these radical empiricist mantras, but the Bacon Newton approach is a good one, and I wish we could get back to
Yeah, definitely. And that's sort of the thing is, the in the 1960s, I believe, with quantum mechanics and the fact that no one really knows what's going on with quantum mechanics, but they were able to model it, we went from this sort of more traditional medieval style of physics where we're trying to find the underlying things of things to just trying to model things really, really well. And I think that if we want to see any progress in science, we're going to have to return to the more ancient sort of theistic understanding of science.
Yeah, and that was Newton and Bacon, who were devout believers in God. So was some of the ones you brought up. Kepler, for example. I believe you brought up Kepler, or
Yeah, that's
who
right.
okay. Yeah, all of these guys were devout believers in God, and not just that they believe that these laws that they believe God had created could be found, and they thought they actually found them. That's what how science emerged, and that's the forgotten story that a lot of the new atheism, seems to forget. But maybe we can go on in discussing my debate.
Sure, definitely.
Do you have any? Well, from what I remember, is he was listing all of these arguments in such rapid pace that I could not get to. I couldn't focus on every little thing. For example, him presuming or presupposing you know, that atheism is somehow the default position. I wish I would have had more time, but it, you know, the discussion, I think where these skeptics and these atheists really fall, because once get them into discussion, I don't think they really uh, they don't have much substance behind these arguments, in my opinion.
Sure, and one of his arguments that he brought up, and I'm just gonna go at it quick because it's sort of an Anglican thing, is he said that if God wrote the Bible, why do we need people to interpret it? Why did God make a Bible that can be misinterpreted?
Yeah.
And there are two things here. One, Christ didn't write the Bible directly. What Christ did is he made disciples and basically founded a civilization and a school of thought and had people teach directly and sort of parent them in a spiritual way. And the Bible was developed sort of in parallel to that. Um,
Hmm.
and so that's the wrong way to look at it, right?
Yeah.
That the Bible didn't fall from the sky. It was it's the textbook it's like the textbook for a school of medicine, right? You could never be a surgeon by just reading a textbook. The best surgeon that you could be, but you definitely need the textbook if you're going to medical school, or the same with any craft. um,
Yeah.
and then the other thing is, th- all things have a multitude of interpretations because we have free will. I mean, part of the interpretation that you choose is partially a choice of will. As anyone's known that's dealt with someone who took a offhand comment and was insulted. I mean, part of that is willful. Um,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What I really think he was attacking was a very narrow, and it was kind of woefully bad argument. But he was attacking biblical inspiration, to saying how God inspired the Bible. It's Muslims, Islam, who thinks God dictated the Holy Scriptures. Um, Christians have a more nuanced view. They say that God breathed and inspired the individuals to write these scriptures. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to have people's unique characteristics in the text. So I really think that was a bad argument, and I said as much.
yeah, exactly. And that's sort of the thing is, there's a caricature of religion going on. And the other thing he talked about was sort of this God of the gaps thing, right?
Hmm.
Where the reason why there was Zeus was because ancient Greeks didn't know where lightning came from, and that's absurd. I mean,
Hmm.
if you read the ancients, they had not necessarily as sophisticated science as we do, but they at least had
Yeah.
like Aristotle level. And the fact that things had natural proximate causes
Hmm.
was distinct from their understanding of the gods.
Yeah.
That's just absurd, especially monotheism, which is very different than sort of this animism or pseudo animism that he's critiquing.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and that's the thing, is that, as we've talked about, the reason why we look for as Christians and investigate a cause of lightning is because we assume that it's comprehensible and understandable, and not just the caprice
The
or
whims.
yeah, the whims of a god.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often hear about you know, the first Christians being gullible, or the people of antiquity being gullible concerning miracles. Now, certainly there was some exaggeration in different parts and in different historians, but when you look at the Gospels, all of these people that they lived with Jesus, and then Jesus was crucified and died, and then he came back. Then he appeared to them alive again. His New Testament historians concur with all of that. It, these people knew when a person was dead. That doesn't, that's not amazing. What's amazing is that they thought a person was actually alive. And N.T. Wright, in his The Resurrection of the Son of God, he discusses this word called anastasis, okay? And that means in Greek, bodily. It refers to the afterlife, to the bodily resurrection. It's what Greeks denied, okay, and some Jews affirmed. It's unbelievable that any Jews would say that Jesus appeared alive, anastasis. That one person would be raised to life in history was simply unique in all of Jewish tradition. So, these weren't gullible people. They didn't have the medical technology that we do, but they had common sense. And so did the Greeks. And it's just, what C.S. Lewis said, this chronological and historical snobbery on a lot of these skeptics' part.
Yeah, well, the irony too is, I mean, and there are multiple stories after the resurrection, but I'll use Thomas because Thomas is my favorite apostle. And Thomas said, "I won't believe until I touch your wounds and feel you and examine you." And that's what happened. And to claim that that's an illusion or a shared hallucination or gullible or whatever is pretty absurd. And
Yeah.
and then so you have to go deeper and deeper in how much of the well, okay, so let's do a thought experiment. Let's assume that humanity is that gullible, right? There's no change in human nature or human genetics that's occurred in the last 2,000 years. So we're just as gullible now as those people were more hundreds or thousands of years ago. What this means is that we have literally no hope of knowing anything about history or any potentially supernatural occurrences, because we're so gullible that the noise drowns out any signal, even about like historical events. I can see no system of history where um, Christ did not exist, or the resurrection, but we can be certain that George Washington existed.
Yeah, it's they try to they try to apply, and I should have mentioned a few of the apologists of the 17th and 18th and 19th century, like Richard Whatley. He used the unbelievable, bizarre circumstances and improbable circumstances associated with Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, and how that could not itself be repeated, and no one, unless they were there, would believe what actually happened. Um, History is a different thing than the repeatable, um, than operation science, that you measure things in a test tube. Um, So yeah, when you take these skeptics into the field of history and the non-repeatable, that's where that's where a lot of the arguments, just crumble.
Yeah, that's right. And, I have to give credit to Dr. Oppie because he bites the bullet, and he basically affirms that he thinks that humans are overly credulous about many things, and that it requires a lot of uncertainty if you deny like miracles. And the other thing that I would just raise as a comment and that Dr. Abe talked about was that there are different traditions with miracles, but there's no necessary conflict with Christianity being true and other traditions having miracles, right? And part of this is sort of a subtlety that I tend to make that others don't, that a miracle in the Christian sense isn't just a supernatural event, it's a supernatural event that is good. So,
Yes, yes.
and that's sort of the thing is that it's like the Hebrews being taken out of captivity. Or the resurrection. It has to be a
Well,
wonder as well as supernatural.
there's a famed New Testament scholar in Germany, and I'm sure you've heard about it or heard of his name. His name is Wolfhard Pannenberg. This is what he says. The resurrection of Jesus takes on such important significance because it's not just anybody who has risen from the dead, but because it's Jesus of Nazareth, whose execution was instigated for his blasphemous claims. If the God of Israel has raised him from the dead, this means that the God of Israel has clearly vindicated those claims to which Jesus was crucified. There's a theological context for which the miracles took place. And, it could also be falsified. It happened in Jerusalem, the very city where, where the purported, appearances and empty tomb and so forth occurred. Which again are held by the vast majority of New Testament scholarship writing today. Um, in our second debate, if indeed it's about miracles, I do hope Graham Uppy studies up on this because I certainly am, and I think a lot could be said about this. By the way, I don't know if I brought the book up when I was talking with Dr. Graham Oppy, but Craig Keener's massive book on miracles, which I mentioned in a number of my debates. I mention it because it's probably one of, if not the most sophisticated book on miracles happening today. Miracles happen today, and they don't undermine science, but they show that they're still we can still trust that scientific laws occur, but sometimes those laws are suspended. Um, I say that if the universe was brought about by God, why couldn't God create a divine miracle in time in the historical process? It seems to me that that's as ever bit as plausible than any other viewpoint.
Yeah, I agree. I mean that's sort of the Christian viewpoint, and I think it's reasonable and is both explanatory and self-consistent. Um, and yeah, and that's sort of the thing too is that miracles and signs don't talk don't talk to people in the abstract. They talk to people concretely, right?
Mm.
So, and there's this really interesting interplay in the New Testament between miracles and faith, and that there has to be an openness to God's grace in order for the miracle to occur, which is sort of
Yeah.
interesting. And I don't know where this fits into the discussion, but I guess the key thing is to sort of emphasize that it doesn't seem that these professional atheists are keeping an open mind or an open heart um,
Yeah, yeah.
and willing to be critical of their own positions.
And
Um,
that's why I kept bringing up the common sense realism position that we need to first come to grips with the world of phenomena, you know, the phenomenal world, and don't make conjectures about theories control us. You know, Jordan Peterson, I wholeheartedly affirm it. We need to have sophisticated ideas where we can integrate all our knowledge from different fields and not let ideas, have us or control us and take us down, these different paths where the evidence does not lead.
yeah, definitely. Um, and think that's sort of the point, is that we don't want to be ruled by we don't yeah um, we don't want to have ha- ideas shouldn't have us. We should have ideas. Just like
Yeah,
we should have wealth. Wealth shouldn't have us. Or we should have
yeah,
desires, and desires shouldn't have us.
yeah.
And I think,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I think that that nails it.
Well, I think we all believe in gods. That I think the atheists can believe in gods too. The gods of wealth, money, power, or sex. It's very unique to us. We let things control us instead of letting God guide us. It just all it takes, I think, is humility for people to try to look at the evidence with an open heart and an open mind, like you said. And it discusses that in the book of James, by the way, if anybody who's listening.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I just want to shout out that Dr. Oppie is a very sophisticated and thoughtful thinker, and he's a philosopher that happens to be an atheist, as opposed to someone who's sort of this evangelical atheism. And I really respect how much time and effort and thought he's put into his position.
Yeah. And I could definitely, feel the vibe in the air when I was debating Dan Barker. You could feel the vitriol against God or anybody who would believe such things as, being a Christian. When I was debating Graham Oppie, I sensed respect and he wanted to listen. So it was a marked contrast between what a sophisticated atheist philosopher is and more of a, you know, how would you best describe Dan Barker?
Uh, 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 one of my
Professional
friends called,
atheist, right?
yeah, one of my friends calls them lobsters, lack of belief stirs, um,
Yeah,
which seemed to be Dan's position of lacking a belief. And I get the feeling that something sort of traumatic might have happened to him, or there's some spiritual disconnect there rather than an
yeah,
intellectual disconnect,
yeah.
and that
I mean,
and yeah.
that's usually it. And Paul Vitz in his book, discusses that. He documents, and I know about this too, not as much as Paul Vitz, but he shows that a lot of these atheists, they simply didn't have father figures or something traumatic happened in their lives. You know, something traumatic has happened in my life, and I'm sure most people's lives, but we got to come to the evidence with humility and with an open heart and an open mind and not let these ideas control us. Instead of being mad at Dan Barker, I pray for him. I hope that, he was a preacher for 19 years. Why not, if you're listening to this, Dan Barker, why not come back to the faith? That there is good evidence to be a Christian.
Yeah, and we at Red Pill Religion welcome people of all faiths, but the leadership team is all Christian, and we consistently both pray for atheists and people that consider themselves our enemy, because that's what Christians do. And to pray for someone means to will the very best for them. And so yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
there's there's a lot of brokenness in the world.
yeah, and you know, in our discussions, and I know we're about to, you know, end this, but in our discussions, you know, on Twitter with these various atheists, I sense it. You can feel it. You can almost cut it with a knife. This anger, this vitriol, and I just this is why I like these conversations because I don't, you know, attack in all of my debates. I've never attacked a person. I've always treated them with respect, and I will always do that because I believe that they're created in the image of God, that they're not mere means to some end. They're they're created with dignity, and indeed that's how I think we all live our lives, no matter if we affirm it with our mouths or not. But Andrew, this was a great discussion.
Yeah, I had a lot of time of enjoyment, and I think it was time well spent. And God bless you all, everyone who's listening and will listen to this, and have a wonderful Sunday or whatever day it is when you listen to this. Bye for now.